For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alex Sloan. I'm always asked to describe myself these days, and I say cheerful Canberran, bubbling to live in this beautiful town, but definitely not living in a Canberra bubble. I will be your guide and MC for this evening's ceremony, and on behalf of our host, Mr. James Caruso, Chargé d'Affaires of the United States Embassy, I want to first thank you all for coming out on this really fantastic, fresh spring evening to join us for the inaugural US Mission Award for Leadership Excellence in honour of Eleanor Roosevelt and the 75th anniversary of the US Embassy in Canberra. And I'd like to acknowledge the Honourable Julie Bishop, the Honourable Bruce Baird, members of the Diplomatic Corps, and all our distinguished guests. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this beautiful residence, the Ambassador's residence. And in doing so, I acknowledge the traditional owners of the place, the Ngunnawal people, and I honour their elders and ancestors for their ongoing custodianship of the land. We're here to celebrate this evening leadership excellence of the highest degree, both present and future. And I'm delighted to start things off by inviting one such emerging leader. Eliza Cowley is a medical student at the ANU. Eliza actually comes from Gundawindi, and she's going to speak on Eleanor Roosevelt's relationship to Australia and this very garden in which we're standing really near. Please welcome the gorgeous Eliza Cowley.
We are here tonight because of one woman's innate sense of what was right, just and necessary, as well as her journey towards a more equal world. It was only in January 1940 the United States established official diplomatic relations with Australia, which had previously been conducted through the government of the United Kingdom. The actual lease on the compound was signed on the 8th of December 1941, at the same time Pearl Harbor was attacked. 2 months later, in February 1942, Darwin's two airfields, along with ships in the harbour, were attacked by 242 Japanese aircraft. This was the first and largest single attack mounted by a foreign power on Australia. In this same year, the Battle of the Coral Sea took place in May, the Battle of Midway in June, as well as the start of the arduous Guadalcanal campaign in August. Against the advice of the US War Department, and despite intense political pressure at home, Eleanor Roosevelt undertook a grueling 5-week tour of the South Pacific on behalf of the Red Cross in August 1943. During her trip, she made 17 stops, including Bora Bora, Fiji, Samoa, New Caledonia, Christmas Island, Guadalcanal, New Zealand, and Australia, speaking to an estimated 400,000 people throughout. Admiral William Halsey, US Commander in the South Pacific, opposed her visit. He had a war to fight, he said, and no time to waste, welcoming a visiting do-gooder. But when the First Lady showed up and went to work, taking on a demanding schedule, he quickly changed his mind. In September 1943, Mrs. Roosevelt reached Australia. At this uncertain time in World War II, with the outcome very much in doubt, she formally opened the residence in which we are all gathered, reaffirming the strength of the Australian partnership with the United States, at the highest levels of leadership. Famously, while here, Mrs. Roosevelt planted a pin oak, which will be discussed in further detail later in the ceremony. Mrs. Roosevelt's visit reinforced to Australians that the United States would stand by them in the darkest hours of conflict. Not only did she make a point of visiting wounded soldiers wherever she went, she was particularly determined to highlight the work women we were doing in Australia to help win the war. When in Sydney, she declared, "Perhaps here is the germ of an idea that the post-war period women will be encouraged to participate in all activities of citizenship. Australians and Americans, men and women alike, hailed her as a beacon of hope." When she returned to New Caledonia on her way home, Admiral Halsey agreed to let her visit Guadalcanal, one of her strongest desires for a trip, and he expressed his newfound admiration for her efforts. I told her that it was impossible for me to express my appreciation of what she had done and was doing for my men. I was ashamed of my original surliness. She alone had accomplished more good than any other person who had passed through my area. Her trip to Guadalcanal was rough, flying without lights in night in unheated military transport to prevent detection by the Japanese, who were regularly bombing the island. She had been travelling non-stop for a month by this time. She was exhausted and had lost 30 pounds. Speaking with soldiers and visiting hospitals and cemeteries left its mark on the rest of her life. Her time in Guadalcanal, in Australia, and throughout the South Pacific made her more determined than ever to secure a durable peace rooted in respect and equality for all after the war. She commented, "If the generation that fights today is to light the foundations on which a peaceful world can be built, all of us who have seen the war at close range must remember what we see and carry is a crusading spirit to all of our work." Eleanor Roosevelt would continue her crusade fighting for equality, social justice and human rights for the rest of her life. Australia, the United States, our partnership and our world are all better off as a result. It is Mrs. Roosevelt's indomitable spirit, her strength of leadership and her unending quest to do what is right that tonight we celebrate in honour of the 75th anniversary of her trip. It is up to us to carry that spirit into the future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eliza. And I think Eleanor would love the fact that Eliza is here on scholarship in her first year doing sciences at the ANU and hopes to become a GP, a rural GP, and I think that really is in the spirit. Now that we've had some history, let me present the present and let you know about really fine pieces of furniture. Now, over here, we just have a look here, and in the foyer you might have come in and seen a table and you might have signed with the most beautiful pen. As Canberra locals know, sadly, the tree planted by Mrs. Roosevelt in 1943 fell in a violent storm in 2015. And these beautiful tables and the pen were made from that exact tree. So there's right here is a direct connection to Eleanor. The tables were actually made by Rolf Barford, who is with us this evening. Rolf, where are you? There he is. Master artist. And also, if I can also acknowledge too the work that Rolf worked really closely with Brendan McCormick from the embassy team. So thank you to both of you for these beautiful connections to Eleanor Roosevelt. Thank you. If I can now invite Mr. Peter DeCure, Chair of the Australian American Fulbright Commission, and Mr. Thomas Doherty, the Director of the Australian American Fulbright Commission, to the lectern. Please make them welcome.
Thank you. On behalf of the Australian American Fulbright Commission's board, staff and scholars, it's an honour to be here this evening to celebrate the leadership and achievements of Eleanor Roosevelt. Travelling to Australia by ship around the Pacific in aeroplanes in the midst of World War II demonstrates courage and strength of character that's required of very few of us today. In post-war years, her leadership continued. She promoted peace, justice and human rights. In 1946, Mrs. Roosevelt was appointed the first chair of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, and that was the same year that the Fulbright Act was signed into law in the US Congress, creating the world's largest international exchange program. The Australian American Fulbright Commission is proud that the very first treaty signed between Australia and the United States was the Fulbright Treaty. It predated even the ANZUS Treaty. It established a bilateral Fulbright program. We are now proud to say that over 5,000 Australians and Americans have studied and lived in each other's countries in the last 70 years. They've had the opportunity to immerse themselves in the culture and to make lifelong friends and lifelong learning. Senator Fulbright and Mrs. Roosevelt both believe strongly in the transformative power of education. To quote Senator Fulbright, we must expand the boundaries of human wisdom, empathy and perception. And there is no way of doing that except through education. Mrs. Roosevelt more succinctly said, education is the cornerstone of liberty. Thank you.
The Fulbright Commission has just completed selections for the current round of Australian Fulbrighters who will study and research in the United States. in 2019. Thanks to the generosity of the Australian and American governments, of individual universities in both countries, of the private sector and the philanthropic foundations, we were able this year to double the number of Australians we're sending to the United States to 70. The new Fulbright Future Awards, funded by the King Ward Foundation, represent almost half of this total, and their goal is to support research and study that has the potential to have a major impact on the lives and livelihoods of Australian citizens and of Australia. The Commission will continue to look for opportunities to grow the program in its anniversary year in 2019. And so, for our anniversary year, Peter and I are very proud this evening to announce the establishment of a Fulbright Eleanor Roosevelt Prize. It will be awarded to an outstanding postgraduate member of each year's Australian cohort who embodies the values of Eleanor Roosevelt and her pursuit of greater understanding, mutual respect, and equality. And we would like to thank the U.S. Mission for its support for this award, which will be awarded annually. We're particularly pleased that this prize is being announced tonight. At the same time, the U.S. Mission Award for Leadership Excellence in honor of Eleanor Roosevelt is being awarded to Julie Bishop. Fulbright in Australia has had no stronger supporter over the years than Julie Bishop, and we are all very grateful for it. And just as Senator William Fulbright is today remembered for the scholarship program he helped establish in 1946, so too will Julie Bishop be remembered for the similar New Colombo plan established in 2014. We know that the goals and achievements of both scholarship plans reflect the spirit and the ideals of Eleanor Roosevelt. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom and Peter. And I'd now like to invite our gracious host, Charge d'Affaires, James Caruso, to the lectern. Please welcome.
Well, good evening. Thanks for all joining us this evening. It's a great honor for me to present the Inaugural Award for Leadership Excellence in honor of Eleanor Roosevelt. And this is the 75th anniversary of her flying here in the midst of World War II to dedicate this beautiful building and these grounds. As strong democracies and world leaders, this moment in history, where the voices of women are increasingly being raised and heard all around the world, is something for Australia and the United States both to celebrate. Speaking out, listening to others, participation by all, are these not the core tenets of our democracies? Like all political systems, democracies also need leaders. We need those who can show us the way towards our better selves, who can solve problems and bridge divides. Eleanor Roosevelt, despite her lack of any official title, was such a leader. In early 1933, the Bonus Army, a protest group of World War I veterans, marched on Washington for the second time in 2 years, calling for their veteran bonus certificates to be awarded early. The previous year, President Herbert Hoover had ordered them dispersed, and the U.S. Army cavalry charged and bombarded the veterans with tear gas. This time, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt visited the veterans at their muddy campsite, listening to their concerns and singing Army songs with them. The meeting diffused the tension between the veterans and the administration, and one of the marchers later commented, "Hoover sent the Army, Roosevelt sent his wife." Although we have a very long way to go, we are now in a time when there are more opportunities for women to be given positions of formal responsibility. And with this award and the inaugural Fulbright Scholarship in honor of Eleanor Roosevelt's extraordinary leadership, the U.S. and Australia are supporting strong young women like Eliza over there, who will not just follow in Eleanor's footsteps, but take up the mantle of leadership and set the course for new heights we have yet to realize. Roosevelt wrote, "Example is the best lesson there is." And today we recognize an exemplar, someone who has broken new ground, someone who has steadfastly represented her country, someone whose long career in public service reflects the highest ideals of Eleanor Roosevelt, someone who has contributed significantly to the U.S.-Australian alliance as foreign minister over the past 5 years. And finally, someone who happens to have been a pleasure to work with. The Honorable Julie Bishop was first elected to the seat of Curtin in 1998, and her first speech to Parliament captured the central tenet of democracy. She said, "I have always had an intense conviction that individuals can make a difference to the life of their times." Julie Bishop knew then the power each person wields and the difference she has been able to make. In just the past 5 years as foreign minister, Julie has promoted greater regional cross-pollination through the New Colombo Plan, worked steadfastly in holding Russia accountable for the downing of Flight MH17, laid out Australia's framework for the next decade to come in the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper, and for me, most importantly, been a tireless advocate for the relationship between our two nations and the positive difference our democracies can make in the world. Shortly after I arrived in Australia, I went with Ambassador Berry to see Julie, to tell Julie that he's returning to the U.S. a few months before our 2016 elections, and therefore I would be charge d'affaires. Now, I had long heard about the blue stare of death. But as a longtime customer of late-night New York City subways, I had my own version, which I called the "Don't mess with me because I'm crazier than you are." So I had that stare down. And so when Julie turned her gaze to me, I was ready. And she said, "Jim, I plan to treat you like I would any ambassador." And she has. And for that, I'm very grateful. So if example is the best lesson there is, and tonight we all honor Eleanor Roosevelt, we have an example of Eleanor Roosevelt's leadership and courage. So I have the pleasure of presenting the Honorable Julie Bishop with the Inaugural U.S. Mission Award for Leadership Excellence. So Julie, could you join me, please?
Thank you, Jim. The finest US ambassador Australia never had. To my family, friends, former ministerial staff, Francis Adamson, diplomats, ladies and gentlemen, I am deeply honoured and touched by this award and commemorative medal in the name of Eleanor Roosevelt. I first became conscious of the role of a First Lady and the White House when I was about 6 years old, and we had National Geographic at home. I vividly recall being utterly captivated by a fold-out glossy edition featuring Jacqueline Kennedy's renovation of the White House. I lay on the floor and pored over every frame endlessly. Of course, she had a global impact, as the President's 1961 visit to France proved. The French-speaking, Givenchy-wearing First Lady so dazzled the French public that at a press conference, President Kennedy said, "I think it not altogether inappropriate that I introduce myself. I am the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris." Of course, no First Lady, before or since, has had a greater impact on global and national affairs than Eleanor Roosevelt, the longest serving First Lady of the United States. She was a public speaker, a columnist, an advocate, an activist, a civil rights reformer, a fundraiser, a lobbyist, and she happened to be the wife of the President of the United States. After he died in 1945, Eleanor Roosevelt continued her work. She was appointed as a representative to the United Nations General Assembly for the United States. She became the first chair of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. She was a driving force behind the development and adoption of the United Nations Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and she continued her powerful work, her advocacy, her public appearances, right up until her death in 1962. As we've heard this evening, she had a connection with Australia. She came here in 1943, 75 years ago, to visit the American troops and the Australian troops. And she met with then Prime Minister John Curtin, who happens to be the only Prime Minister ever from Western Australia, and after whom my seat of Curtin is named. And as we've heard, she made a grueling visit across the Pacific, 17 locations including New Zealand, thus demonstrating during the darkest days of World War II how much the United States appreciated the role of their allies and friends in the Pacific. But she also demonstrated leadership and courage and her fine appreciation of the importance of friends of the United States. Her legacy has endured, and she paved the way for so many women in the United States to be deeply involved in public life, in foreign policy. And I've had the privilege as Foreign Minister to meet and learn from some outstanding female Secretaries of State, Madeleine Albright, Condoleezza Rice, and Hillary Clinton. And I've worked with outstanding US representatives at the United Nations, Samantha Power and Nikki Haley. When I became Foreign Minister, I was determined to ensure that our relationship with the United States was a priority of the highest order. And I set about making contacts and connections across the administration so that I could help broaden, deepen and strengthen this already extraordinary alliance. I met on a number of occasions with President Obama and President Trump. I met with Vice President Joe Biden and Vice President Mike Pence, with Secretaries of State John Kerry, Rex Tillerson and Mike Pompeo. Through our OSMIN meetings, the 2+2 Foreign and Defence annual ministerial meetings, I came to know and work with the Defence Secretaries in Ash Carter, Chuck Hagel and Jim Mattis. On my frequent visits to Washington, I came to know the national security community and met with National Security Advisors Susan Rice and with General McMaster and with John Bolton. And I also got to know the inner circle of the intelligence community, the Director of National Intelligence, Jim Clapper, the then head of the CIA, John Brennan. And it was through these connections and this engagement that we were able to have frank exchanges on our priorities, our values, our interests. And I think we were able to influence US thinking from time to time. After all, that's what friends can do. Let me give you an example. When Australia adopted the term Indo-Pacific to represent our thinking on our place in the world, the Indo-Pacific, the Indian Ocean, Asia-Pacific, as articulated in our 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper. We shared our thinking with the United States, and it was reflected in their National Security Statement, and indeed Pacific Command has now been renamed Indo-Pacific Command. The United States is our strongest, deepest, most important economic partner. And through our trade and our investment, the United States is a significant partner for us. And that's why I reinvigorated G'day USA, the premier public diplomacy forum that we held across the United States, driving business and investment opportunities from Seattle to New York and connecting our creative industries in Hollywood and Silicon Valley. And I do recall one particularly important tourism initiative when I launched a Visit Australia campaign featuring our beaches, our sun, our surf, and Chris Hemsworth in New York in the middle of the worst blizzard that New York had experienced in decades. That's what I call exquisite timing. The United States is our strategic partner in defence, in intelligence and economic terms. And this year marks the 100th anniversary of our military partnership, for it was on the 4th of July 1918 that General John Monash led a combined force of US and Australian troops at the Battle of Hamel, which many say turned the tide of World War I. And we have stood side by side, shoulder to shoulder, in every major military conflict since that time. We look to the United States as vital in safeguarding global peace and stability, security and prosperity. We look to the United States as a beacon of hope and freedom and liberty and human advancement. And my passion for the United States and its people knows no bounds. You know who your friends are in good times and in tough times. The United States has been there for us. We've been there for the United States. That is the true test of friendship. And I have been privileged to be the custodian of this relationship for the past 5 years.